Okay. Um, I hope people are still trickling in into this webinar series that we are starting today on the 2nd of July. So this welcome everyone to this first webinar in the series Climate Change, Environmental Security and Political Risks. Today we have with us Dr. Sujatha Byravan and Dr. Sudhir Chella Rajan, who will share their insights on the topic, a time for planetary solidarity, learning lessons and the need for fundamental change. So as you can see, the topic that we are going to talk about is quite relevant for today's times when we are facing so many different kinds of crisis at the same time. We have the pandemic, we have climate change, which was there before as well, but it just looks like people are not paying as much attention to it right now. We have a host of other crises that are also affecting human security and our well-being, human well-being to a large extent. So before I move on to the to the interview that we have with the two esteemed guests who have joined us today, I would like to introduce the Center for Climate Studies, COVINTS and PRISM, and the Center for Climate Studies, of which I'm the co-coordinator, is based at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, Karnataka. It aims to undertake high impact, multidisciplinary, problem driven research for end to end solutions to climate change and to create a pool of multidisciplinary researchers to serve the growing need for sustainable climate policy, governance, and diplomacy. It was established recently in 2018, and so we have a long way to go in terms of expanding our research and development in the field of climate change and sustainable development. Covert Overt Intelligence Solutions, COVINS, is headquartered in Bangalore. COVINS is our partner in this webinar series. COVINS is focused on delivering customized turnkey solutions from risk analysis, equipment to training, etc., tailored to meet customers' most challenging needs. COVINS pride themselves on their ability to work under critical situations whilst maintaining the highest standards and delivering the optimal solutions. Political Risk and Intelligence Services Management, which is a division of COVINS, is focusing on providing customized solutions again for interested stakeholders in the areas of political risk, focusing on geopolitical, geoeconomic, socio-economic, and socio-political risk areas. In order to know about these areas, products, services, whether it's COVINS, PRISM, or the Center for Climate Studies, Manipal Academy of Higher Education, please do check out our websites or do get in touch with us directly anytime. So let me introduce our speakers as well. Their bios are already put up on the link on which all of you registered. Dr. Sujatha Byravan, she has several years of experience. In fact, one of the problems that I had was how do I condense so much of experience and so many fortes that she has built over a period of time into just one paragraph. But yeah, she basically, she works in the broad area of sustainable development, bolstered by her education in the biological sciences. So, she's the right person to talk about what we are right now facing today in 2020, which is turning out to be one of the most difficult years in our lifetime, at least. Her PhD and postdoctoral work in the US were followed by a 2 year training fellowship from the Rockefeller Foundation in leadership and environment and development, work experience in India, and a leadership position as main architect and fellows program director in an international environment and development organization. She was later president of a US based nonprofit working on the social and ethical impacts of biotechnology, including research, advocacy, social justice, and education. Over the past several years, she has been based in India, is involved with research, analysis, and evaluation of some aspects of climate change policy. And then we have Dr. Sudhir Chella Rajan, who teaches at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Madras. He was formerly head of department and was coordinator of the Indo-German Center for Sustainability between the years 2010 and 16. He is currently the area coordinator for land use there. He obtained an interdisciplinary doctorate in environmental science and engineering from the University of California, Los Angeles, and has worked in progressively senior positions in government, research consultancies, NGOs, and academia. His research interests are primarily at the interface of political theory and the environment, in particular on the new challenges that enter politics within democratic societies in the face of composite social and environmental encounters. So yeah, both our speakers have wide range of experience, and I hope the audience will have a lot of questions to ask. This is going to be interactive in nature. There will be questions from my side. And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram. I'm from the Center for Climate Studies. I'm co-coordinating the center, so I will be asking the questions. But like I said, we are open to as many questions as the audience would like to ask our two speakers. So please keep the questions coming. Even while the speakers are speaking, we don't have to wait till the end to ask the questions. And we will have a couple of polls as well, wherein you can express your interest in any particular or specific areas in which you would like to hear our speakers speak more. So yeah, so thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and thank you so much to the speakers, especially for joining us. Welcome. Okay, so let me get started. I don't want to waste too much time on the introductions. So what I want to start with is, of course, I think like I said, like I mentioned even in my introduction, is what we are facing today with the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have a climate emergency as well. And I think this is something that nobody can deny. But at the same time, there seems to be, that problem with systemic change. I think that is something that everyone is talking about. But in terms of being able to deal with multiple risks at the same time, we are still far behind in that way. And I think probably you should probably start by reflecting on the similarities that we have with the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis, on which I think we are far too late on, to really act upon it. What are your thoughts on this? This question is posed to both of you, and you can just flag off your thoughts on that.
Both these crises, the COVID and climate catastrophes, I'm going to call them, are of a global scale. And it immediately persuades one to think about how can we compare these two, and are there some similarities, and can we learn perhaps from one to act on the other. I think what COVID has done has really demonstrated that we are globally interconnected in so many different ways. And to start off with, this is a zoonotic infection, meaning it's come from animals to humans. And there are many other things. So we can think about many other kinds of similarities. Here we talk about the needing to reduce the number of infections. What do we need to do? I mean, basically, the lockdown, the whole process is meant to reduce the total number of infections, and also to make it to help the public health system to prepare and to manage it better. Now, similarly, if you were to, I mean, in climate change, we talk about bringing things down to below certain thresholds, keeping the temperature below either 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius compared to average pre-industrial temperatures. So, the conversation about thresholds, the efforts, the identification with the global pandemic, which appears completely out of control, and creating, putting a pause on all our activities in many different stages. It's been quite severe. The other thing, I mean, I would say is we have recognized that inequality has really, has the fact. I mean, we all know that we are a very unequal society, but it's brought the focus right there on the fact that people who were the migrants, the poor, the marginalized, they were the ones who were in the picture. When everyone was able to lock down, they could not. Right? So they were not in a situation to have the social distancing and do the kind of things that we were required to do. And it shows that, first of all, that the Piketty and others have been talking about rising inequality in America, in the US, in India, and in other places. And they have been pointing out, and others too have been pointing out, other economists have been pointing out that inequality has been really rising in India. And we need to do a number of things to address that. Now, that is a separate conversation altogether. But the point is that this brought that into focus. And the fact that when we went into lockdown, 50 days after the World Health Organization announced that this was a global emergency, we did not take into consideration the fact the large number of people who are our people who contribute to the economies, and who are completely forgotten in their decision making. That is something that we need to remember. And the similarity with climate is that in climate, when catastrophes arise, and we have had them, and we can see already that when there are heat waves and when there are severe storms and hurricanes that we have seen, those who suffer are the ones who are, are living in houses that are very vulnerable. They're living in places that are vulnerable. So all of those things, there are many similarities between the two that we can see. And
Yeah, I would just add to that the quality of the institutions seems to matter a lot when we think about any kind of global catastrophe like this. So as Sujatha pointed out, the global character of this is actually quite profound. We suddenly realize that we are not, we're not parochial beings. Something that started in possibly in a lab or in an environment far away in Wuhan, and then suddenly became this out of control pandemic around the world, shows us how vulnerable we are as humanity and as a species. Right? We're not just as Indians or Chinese or Americans or whatever else. Right? We are a human species, and we are connected. And this sort of brings home to roost the fact that we can't be thinking parochially. We can't be thinking just in terms of our own narrow neck of the woods. Right? So that's something quite profound. But the impacts of what happened are completely different in different parts of the world, and a lot of that has to do with the quality of institutions as much as the prevailing levels of inequality. Right? So even though things were very intense when they started in Italy in February and March, right? So that's when the world recognized that this was going to be a very, very severe disease, a very severe public health crisis. We must remember that Italy has one of the world's best public health systems. Everybody, anybody, even a tourist can access the best healthcare. Because I know this because my sister was suffering from cancer. She landed up in Italy about 10 years ago, and she collapsed in a restaurant once, and immediately she was admitted to the hospital. No questions asked. Tests, treatment, everything was offered to her. Right, and that country suffered greatly. So institutions. So that actually, even despite their buffer, and despite the ways in which they managed this inequality, they still had these crises. So countries that don't have good public health systems, or where healthcare has been completely privatized, the US is a prime example of that. Things are collapsed completely beyond control. I mean, the numbers of deaths that you've seen in the US are mind-boggling, right? 120,000 people dying and no end in sight. This is not what you expect from an advanced industrialized country. And in India, things may just start. We might be actually at the beginning of a much worse crisis. I don't know, 6 months from now. I don't want to be sound too alarmist, but what I'm trying to get at, I think, is that this is a crisis that has hit us very suddenly in a very short period of time. Climate change we've known about for at least 30 years. In fact, longer, for 120 years ago. Arrhenius pointed out that growing concentrations of anthropogenic greenhouse gases will lead to rise in warming. And since then, there have been lots of studies, especially starting in the 1960s. But the international community, started to take notice only in the 92. And
1980s, fossil fuel companies knew that about climate change.
Yes, but so we've had a lot of time to prepare, and the crisis for climate change is going to be much worse for longer periods of time with manifold effects. It's a slow-moving catastrophe compared to COVID-19. But nevertheless, it's something that gives us the kind of indication that we ought to pay attention to institutions, to questions of inequality, questions of our global connectedness, and so on.
I think it also points to the fact that we require good social security. So what we have done is actually the fact that we had institutions such as the PDS, Public Distribution System, and NREGA. These have helped, and I'm very pleased to learn about the extension of this Anna Yojana, the PDS plan, to the end of November, so that a large number of people can avail of it. And I think so basically this social security that we have is going to now really help us and help everyone to rely on it. But what we don't have is the public health. So what it tells us is that if you want to think about catastrophes, either this epidemic kind or the climate kind, and in fact what we're going to see in future is catastrophes coming together. So we are going to have climate change is a very long, as Chella was explaining, is something that is going to unfold over a long period of time. So during that time, we're not going to have epidemics sitting back and saying, okay, now is a climate crisis. We're going to have epidemics. We're going to have other things. So when those things happen, we need to have good social security that we can rely on, because good development is the kind of foundation that you want. Good social security measures is the foundation that you want, on which you can then build specific measures to adapt and adjust to the kind of climate impacts that one expects. So you can't do it when you have extreme poverty. You can't do it when people don't have sufficient food or good health care. So you need to provide the good basic social security measures. So I think it also cautions us that wherever our institutions, these are social security, they have failed, we need to really start making sure that they are built up, because we require them for climate and for other disasters.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, actually related to that, in fact, immediately when the lockdown was actually imposed in most parts of the world, one of the things that everybody talked about is, the greenhouse gas emissions have reduced, and some kind of behavioral change has been triggered because of this. Okay. But do you think it's too naive and probably too early to say any of this? Because we saw that after the 2008, the 7-8 financial crisis, okay, during that period, the emissions did come down and everybody thought, okay, this is a good sign for the climate. But immediately after that, we saw how there was a boom in the industry, and then the emissions went back up, so how do you see in terms of the post COVID-19 so-called green recovery? A lot of people are definitely talking about it, but are there any lessons that we could learn possibly? Okay, we might be naive to think, okay, this is something good, but at what cost? That is another question that we need to ask. But at the same time, what are the lessons possibly that we could take forward? One of the things that you mentioned about the institutions and everything, this is probably the time to rethink on how do we really rebuild our institutions or restructure our institutions. So what is your take on the lessons that we could possibly learn from this time?
So when we started to see emissions going down because of and there's also talk about less pollution and so on. One thing it certainly did is it reminded us that it's possible for things to change quite quickly, right? So at least in terms of behavior, in terms of actions, things can change quite quickly. But you are quite right. I mean, there's the way things changed also meant a huge contraction of the economy, lots of suffering as a result, lots of jobs that were lost, and so on. So the human cost of this change was actually quite profound. Nevertheless, I think one of the things we did, so again, this is where inequality also becomes useful to think about. So Anil Agarwal and Sunita Narayan from the Center for Science and Environment, more than 3 decades ago, they started making this distinction between luxury emissions and survival emissions. And that they were talking about in the context of the international negotiations. They were saying, well, rich countries have the ability to reduce their emissions much more drastically than poor countries, because poor countries need a lot of time to develop. A lot of the emissions associated with development are really survival emissions. emissions from using LPG, improving your, providing lighting for the poor, and so on, as opposed to driving SUVs or something else.
Flying,
right? So I think the same kind of argument can be made from the COVID-19 experience. The lockdown and various other measures that reduced unnecessary activity was also associated with reduced consumption of luxury items, one might say, right? So a lot of things that were superfluous were reduced. A lot of travel, that not just for vacations or other kinds of things, a lot of business travel and meetings that needn't have taken place were forced to contract, and then we started having meetings like this, like the one we're having right now, and that seems to be perfectly reasonable for most kinds of activity. Not everything, of course, but at least for many categories of meetings, one can have online activity. And this is not rocket science. This technology has been around for a very long time, right? And when people used to make the argument, why do you have to have I've been asked, Sujatha has been asked to go to Delhi, or when we were in the US, to go to some other part of the US for some meeting which only lasted half a day, and pointless, because the whole thing could have been done on the phone or online. So what I think this ought to remind us, and I hope these lessons stay with us, is that luxury emissions and unnecessary activity, not just individual choices, but even institutions that sort of organize these kinds of activity, that has to sort of change, and that could potentially lead to a reduction in emissions, right? But in terms of longer term lessons, I think apart from those kinds of activities and so those kinds of changes, we also need to ask the question: how do we restructure industry? How do we restructure other types of other activities relating to emissions that are equally important in sort of reducing overall emissions? Does COVID-19 give us? We haven't fully analyzed all of those kinds of things. And the last thing I wanted to say was, look, we keep talking about. For a long time, energy economists have figured this out, but the general public seems to assume that increasing GDP is necessarily linked to increasing emissions. But those who have been working in the domain have, at least for the past few decades, recognized that it's possible to increase your economic growth without increasing it. So you can decouple economic growth from emissions. But what we also want to ask is it possible to decouple economic growth from human well-being, right? And that's something that we haven't figured out, but maybe this pause button that the COVID-19 crisis has placed on us can give us an opportunity to do that. I don't know if you have something to
See
add.
that what I wanted to say was there is a lot of many economies have actually put in stimulus money to stimulate their economies because of this COVID crisis. And there was an analysis from Bloomberg Finance, and what they say is about 500 billion of this $500 billion has been given to fossil fuel industry as part of this. So when you're talking about a completely different economy or a completely restructured world, and how is that going to happen? That cannot happen in this kind of setting. It cannot happen when we are still talking about bailing out fossil fuel industries. And it cannot happen when, while others have been, it's not like people have been screaming about this. So we want to make sure that the kind of investment that takes place now is one that will really invest in a green economy for the post-lockdown period. We want to come out of this with a lot of lessons learned, and for that we want to build new kind of institutions, new infrastructure, and new economies. But that is not happening because of the way you can follow the money and you can see that that's not what's happening. So I think those things, the world might not change very much. if that's what's going to happen. Because, that is a very important part of this. Cutting down emissions, that's the main thing. That's what all the conversation is about in climate and about adaptation. So,
Yeah. Actually, one of the questions from the audience is interesting. It's linked to that. Is India ready? And I think that's a very relevant question to ask, like specific to India. You talked about a lot of issues about infrastructure, institutions. Uh, what, in your opinion, is India's situation right now in terms of introducing all these reforms?
Well, it's a huge task for India, obviously, and I think some parts of the 20 lakh crore package that were announced were interesting and important from that perspective, because it paid attention to the micro, small, and medium scale enterprises, the MSME sector. Right now, it turns out that the bulk of the industrial employment in India, is actually people who are self-employed or working in one of these types of activities. A lot of rural households are women making kakras or pickles and so on, right? So these micro enterprises are. I'm sorry, have we lost you, or are you still online?
I think we've lost her. Maybe we should continue and she'll be back.
Okay. I don't know if others can hear us. We're just going to continue speaking. Okay, let me look at a question here. Right, so there are some questions. So this, I see the screen moving, so I think we are still online. So
Dhanasree, we've lost you. Anyway, shall I go on?
Yeah. So I just wanted to say that. So in terms of what actions need to be taken in India, a focus on micro and small enterprises is very important. Providing infrastructure to them, and we don't fully know what those needs are. There needs to be a much better assessment at a very decentralized level as to what kinds of needs there are for the most vulnerable parts of the economy. Right? Similarly, in farming, it's not just business as usual. There needs to be. It's not just that they need loans; they need cash in hand, for instance, right? Through this crisis, and public health infrastructure that we talked about. Did we lose you, Vignesh?
No, you were. We could hear you. Yeah,
okay.
I think Dhanasree has just lost a bar at her place, so you can just continue. Yeah.
All right. So I don't know if I answered this person's question.
So this was, is India ready? That was a
yes, that was the question. Yes.
And so the question is, so I think you answered the COVID part of it. I'm not sure whether the question was directed to the climate aspect, but there's
so the question is, there is a lot of talk about green resilient recovery from COVID, and which will also address the climate conundrum. Is India capable or ready? That was the question.
Right. I think we answered a bulk of that. But what India, in terms of climate, what we are doing right now, that this year the climate COP has been postponed. It was supposed to be held towards the end of the year in England, actually in Scotland, and that's been postponed. But what we need to, I think this gives us kind of a gap here to focus on many other different things. We need to start focusing on what we can do at the state levels. So various states in the country are in the process of finalizing their second round of state action plans. And state action plans, the first round was submitted much earlier in 2008-9. And what we need to think about in the second round is, instead of taking a view perspective where we have been looking at it simply as projects for climate change projects that will be done by the Environment Division, we need to really think about what are the different development schemes, what are the development programs that are in place, and how do we start integrating climate with these particular programs. So we should not have, in addition to just having projects, we should actually work with existing government programs and think about how we can modify it to adjust to the anticipated climate change impact. So this is kind of a complicated thing and might sound abstract, but it has been done fairly well in some parts of the country. If someone's interested, I can get into that.
Yeah, so it's the first poll question which we have is actually related to this area of whether India is ready. But in fact, in our discussions, when we wanted to come up with certain poll questions for the audience, we were quite interested in knowing from the audience's perspective, where probably you can also fill up on that part. I'll just put up the first question basically on. So what in terms of the post-COVID-19 recovery, which sectors need major green restructuring was the question. So I would request the audience to actually give in their perspective into this. And once we are able to come up with certain results, probably our speakers for today can give some shed some light on that.
So are you expecting the audience to respond to you?
Yes, yes. So the audience can just select one of the sectors and just press submit. We will be able to get your answers for the poll online.
You were leading a poll for us in April. So when that is going on, maybe I can just respond to something about
Yes, yes.
permafrost. And I wanted to say that in the last few days, there's been news about the temperature in Siberia being 37 degrees Celsius. That is far above the average temperatures that they see in the this time of the year. This is just summer, beginning of summer. So
It's about 15 degrees above.
yeah, so
20
it's
degrees.
37 degrees Celsius is like Chennai temperature. This is in Siberia. So the permafrost is melting, large amounts of methane are being released. And so there's a lot of concern about the kind of changes that people are seeing while this COVID crisis is going on and we are all paying attention. Our attention is diverted. There are a lot of things happening in the climate system and sector.
Yeah, we are actually getting our audience views on this, and it's quite interesting. And in fact, majority seems to be moving towards green restructuring for human health as one of the sectors. And we'll just give another few minutes for all of our audience who joined us today to vote. And I think I welcome Dhanasree back. I can see her back on the screen.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. We have the because of the monsoon, we have like a lot of power cuts here, and yeah, so because of that, the Wi-Fi gets disconnected, and then I have to like wait for it to reboot. Yeah.
Inequality.
Yeah.
So the other thing that I wanted to add in the context of since we're talking about post-COVID climate, what is going to happen, and Chella talked about the institutions, Dhanasree, when you were gone. The last COP that took place in Madrid, there was a complete logjam along the many different conversations that have been taking place in the international forum at the COP. So these have to do with finance, have to do with means of implementation, pre-2020 action, loss and damage. A lot of the logjam is around issues which are about provision of funds, technology, capacity development for developing countries by the developed countries or rich countries, in short. So the thing is, this kind of, so in what is a big concern in this crisis and in the kind of changes that have been taking place globally in climate is that how are we going to continue? We require funds for even to address, even for countries which have at Paris agreed in the Paris Agreement to fulfill their NDCs, that is, nationally determined contributions. Every country came up with its own plan for mitigation and adaptation and said that we would do these things. And the bulk of those NDCs or promises that were made, plans that were made, are conditional, which means that they require support from rich countries for the implementation. Now, so this is a very important thing, and that is not going away, whether we had COVID or not have COVID. Now, the thing is, this is the really big challenge in the conversation that is taking place at the international level at the COP, and this has to be resolved. And without doing that, we are in dire straits as far as climate is concerned. We are already at 415 parts per million for carbon dioxide. And greenhouse gases, even if they go down for a short time, they're continuing to rise. And the impacts we see are a delayed response to accumulated greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere. So, this is another place where inequality plays. So since we were started out with talking about some similarities between climate and COVID, I want to point out that inequality of power and the unjust global systems that we live in, that is contributing to the kinds of problems that we are having at the international level in the international negotiations. So
it's also to this question of, is India capable? So our capacity is also, in some respects, not entirely, but in some respects, dependent on this sort of some support, some freeing up. So we also have a very huge fossil fuel infrastructure that's getting locked in place. So we need to sort of, making that transition requires a lot of changes and a lot of support.
And this kind of support we're talking about is not, I should say, is not something, it's not charity. So the thing is, the cumulative emissions that we have from, say, 1850, if you look at the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the bulk of those greenhouse gases, close to 2/3 of them, have been emitted by the rich countries. And even today, the emissions by rich countries continue to rise. And if you look at per capita emissions, they are very high. In the US, which, by the way, has not fulfilled Kyoto, has not fulfilled the Copenhagen pledges, and is now pulling out of Paris, technically in November of this year. So we are, so the rich countries are not fulfilling their obligations. On the other hand, some of them are not even acknowledging that climate change is taking place or climate change exists. So there are very large challenges that are facing us on climate.
Yeah. Actually, so according to the survey that we had, most of the people are focusing on human health. Interestingly, so probably because of the times that we are in, I guess. So I would actually request you to think about, or maybe just reflect on a few interventions according to you that could possibly be put in place in terms of the restructuring in human health and public health. Like you mentioned, public health is something that is still not being focused upon. So if you can give us some ideas, or anything that, especially in the Indian context, that could help restructure this particular sector.
The quality of public health that we have has to improve tremendously, so that everyone can actually use that public health system. As Chella was talking about, the quality of healthcare that you see in different countries in Europe is public health, and it's a very good quality. That is the kind of public health that we need to have in place, and that's what we should aim for and shoot for. The other
just to add to that, I mean, we keep telling ourselves, well, we're a poor country, we can't really spend all that much in public health. But as a percentage of GDP, we're spending far less than even developing countries, even our neighbors, right? I forget the figures, but I think it's less than 1%. It's a fraction of a percent, right? And that's actually a huge challenge. I mean, that the fact that our public spending on health systems is so low, and instead, what are we doing? We're celebrating the places like Manipal and Apollo and so on, which have come in to fill the gap, but who can access them? Only those who can pay, and increasingly, even middle class and upper middle class people will find it difficult to pay for these extraordinary procedures.
Yeah, already find it difficult to pay for many of the kinds of things that are suggested, medical.
So the UK, for instance, has a National Health Service that has been working for a very long time, very, very effectively, notwithstanding a few problems here and there. I mean, it's actually a remarkable testament to its success, the fact that it's been effective for so long. And all over Europe, you have similar systems. And this is not rocket science. China has a very effective public health care system. So in a sense, this has not been a priority, and one hopes that this crisis will actually force us to pay attention to that. The fact that the government is spending so little on public health, and those state governments which do spend a lot of money, like Kerala, which have been equally effective in combating this crisis or addressing it to a certain point.
They've been able to manage this much better. So I
Yeah.
think so paying attention to the quality of public health is the
Public investment in health.
Okay. So let me actually go on to the next question, which is, of course, something that both of you already mentioned about the pace at which the negotiations are going and the kind of commitment that most countries are making. There's a huge gap, as you can see, between policy and science. That interface doesn't seem to be working well. I was just thinking, like, what could be the future of climate action from here on? Because most of not just climate action, even in other areas like biodiversity, most of these conventions have been postponed. They're happening next year. Paris Agreement, some of the financial mechanisms had to be charted out by this year. That's probably not happening because of the situation we are in. So there is a lot of uncertainty now. I mean, already the pace at which it was going was quite slow, and there is a fear that this is going to get even more dragged than what we feared. So what do you think is what, in your opinion, could be the future? Like, how do you see things panning out? Who do you think is going to take more responsibility? Do you see community action probably, taking over the so-called top-to-down kind of policies, which are not really working as expected? What is your opinion on those aspects?
See, even with the failure of the last COP at Madrid, there were already some good discussions about the fact that we require something that's a parallel COP, and which would take place where sub-state actors like various NGOs, civil society organizations, academicians, cities, regions and states, like in certain parts of India, different states, their state action plans are working well. So you could imagine them having conversations, sharing their ideas, looking at how what programs have worked well for them, and sharing lessons. I think also at the last COP there was a lot of problems. There were protests, and some groups were not allowed to enter the main place where the meeting was taking place. So this led to this kind of a plan being proposed, and I think it's a very good idea. So while I would not I would not do away with the UNFCCC or say that we should not have this kind of an international negotiation process, because I think it is extremely valuable, and all countries cannot operate by themselves on their own, saying that we can manage this and we will do whatever. We need to have some kind of a global strategy. After all, this is a global problem, and so we need to come to some kind of a agreement on how we move forward and share what we do, and place responsibility where it belongs, and fight for our rights and whatever needs to be done, and agree on targets. Those things are important, otherwise things will not get accomplished. Even with targets, they're not getting accomplished. So there is a lot of value in having a multilateral process that brings together nation states and others. We're just saying that other groups that are having similar good experiences in learning from and carrying this forward, and not just the states, but other sub-state actors need to start playing a bigger role. Apart from that, I also think that I think there is a lot of value to having actually regional agreements and regional meetings having on climate. There is a lot of value to this for many reasons. One is, of course, we share rivers, borders, coastlines, and all those things. But apart from that, there are many. We share the extreme events, many of them that take place. So storms hitting, say, India will also hit Bangladesh, and you'll have, as we start seeing patterns of droughts and other things emerging, we are going to see a lot of similarities. And since our overall general climate systems are the same, should be able to learn from each other's experiences in that too. And I'm talking about migration. We're talking about when things get really bad, there are going to be a lot of migrants from different parts of in different parts of the world, not just South Asia. And in fact, there are some agreements among African nations that you might be aware of, Dhanasree, where they have agreed on working together on issues on migration, but not necessarily on climate-related migrants. But since they already have some kind of shared views and agreements, I think it opens the opportunity, the window for talking about climate-related things. And I think there should be a lot more emphasis on regional agreements. And I think that's another thing that we need to work on.
So I agree with everything Sujatha said, but just to follow up, I want to sort of make a comment on what has happened to multilateralism in the climate context. Right? So these negotiations have been going on for close to 3 decades now, and in the beginning, things were very clear. Article 3.1 of the UNFCCC document is actually a very clear document. The original document that laid down climate law, that sort of established the sort of a founding document. We can call it the constitution of the whole climate law process. It's very clear. It has very clear rules, very clear requirements. It says, look, all countries are responsible for addressing the climate crisis, but some countries are more responsible than others because they've been emitting more, and they should take the lead and all that. Since then, corporate lobbies, especially the fossil fuel lobbies in the US in particular, US and Europe in particular, but also from other parts of the world, have worked extremely hard to convince their representatives, their countries, and they've really corrupted the system, right? So they've made the rules so arcane. So today, if you were to go to a COP, a Conference of Parties meeting, and if you try to look at the documents that are presented, you can't make head or tail, even if you're a very well-trained lawyer, right? And so this is the state of affairs, and it's deliberate. It's sort of meant to obfuscate, meant to make things so complicated that common people won't be able to figure out what's actually going on. And that's the reason why young people, a year and a half ago protested, in some of the most remarkable protests ever in the world, right? I don't remember, some 12 million people around the world.
When the meeting took place in New York, ahead of the COP convention.
Yeah, so the youth climate meeting, protests and their movements and so on are trying to put pressure on this process. But the process seems to be broken in the sense that it's gotten so arcane and so complex. We need to sort of recover the ethical core, the justice components. What are we trying to do, really? We're trying to achieve environmental justice. We're trying to achieve earth justice, if you like. Right? We want to make sure that we leave the earth in safe hands, and that this transition is fair to all parties concerned. And that message has to come back to this process. And that's part of the reason why having some of these parallel events and so on is valuable. because it puts pressure. So you can't say, well, those experts are dealing with it, let them figure it out. We can no longer do that.
Because which means that you can have conversations, civil society groups in India and the US and Europe could have various conversations and come to agreements and start applying pressure together on their governments for various things. So there are a lot of opportunities that are available to do this, and actually it already takes place, but not to the extent that it still can, and that is needed, I think.
Yeah. Okay. So I think at this point we can probably have the second poll up, because the second poll is related to the question of future environmental and political climate action, and what are the real problems that we are facing. There are many, of course, but it's probably also good to see what people think of the negotiations. Are they really understanding all these processes well enough? So this is the question. What are the biggest hurdles in urgent and proactive climate change action? Of course, nationalism, populism is something that is increasingly becoming an issue now. Climate skepticism, there's a lot of anti-science sentiments, which of course goes with issues like pandemic as well. Geopolitical and geoeconomic constraints, the whole divide between the developed and the developing countries, and the kind of divisions that exist within the developing countries as well, that does matter. And of course, lack of political will sometimes matters more than the others. So yeah, I would request the audience to kindly vote, and then we can have some more discussions on this. And at the same time, as the audience votes, maybe I can also pick up a few questions that have come your way. There's an interesting question on Make in India, since you mentioned about India's, whether India is ready to handle this post COVID-19 recovery in a green way. I mean, that green word is still something that needs to be defined in a way that is more practical. But Make in India factor how does it really impact climate change? Because the whole idea of Make in India is also to expand India's manufacturing base and so on. So do we need to categorically define the production matrix with accordance to the emission level targets or emissions reduction targets? So what are your views on that?
Okay, let me start by saying what we understand by the word green. We would substitute the word sustainability for green. And sustainability rests on three pillars, as you know. It's the economic, the ecological, and the social. And most people think about green and they say, well, reduce emissions, add some renewables, and that's green. And we would emphatically say that that's not enough. You really have to think about the economic, that is it actually improving prosperity? Economic, not necessarily in terms of GDP and growth, but really in terms of prosperity or well-being, and the social, which has a whole range of elements associated with it. First of all, questions of inequality and equity, one might say, right? Are you improving equity? Is it a set of activities that is improving equity, and in so doing also improving solidarity. Solidarity is not a word that we hear very much these days, but it's extraordinarily important. It's important, particularly in societies like ours that are so fractious and fragmented and so contentious and segregated, right? So those elements make up green, at least in the way in which we understand it. And so then the question comes, okay, how do you apply those principles to particular forms of activities, certain kinds of policies and processes? And then you'll have to say, well, how do we make sure that this particular set of actions, say Make in India, actually promotes prosperity? Well, it could promote prosperity because, like we said, especially if the Make in India means not giving SOPs to already large corporations, to the wealthiest companies in the country, and then saying, okay, you go make
to set up solar plants.
So go make solar plants. Rather to say, well, how do we actually think about the weakest sectors, and instead of celebrating jugaad, which is actually a very dangerous kind of putting together things that may be unsafe, but actually providing support, right? Why is it that our engineers don't like to work with their hands, right? Why is it that they don't actually build things with? Why don't they collaborate with ITIs, with technical institutes? Why is it that we're all doing software in engineering universities, and then the people who end up actually repairing our power lines, repairing, building various things, have little or no training. They have to sort of learn on the job, right? So those are the kinds of emphases that I would say we would have to sort of.
We need to start thinking about.
Yeah.
So, for example, the Make in India could be, instead of giving these large companies that had power plants now having many hectares of solar farms. Instead of that, what we could have done is actually had the solar technology at local, rural, community levels, managed at the community level to improve livelihoods, and they also, increase kind of democratization, because you have local ownership, you have create some kind of enthusiasm for this. Some new kind of innovative practices might emerge from this, because the same thing might not work in different places depending on the local weather conditions and practices. So we provide lots of opportunities and avenues for people to start innovating and managing their local technologies, and creating kind of democratic systems which are decentralized and strengthened as a result. Instead, we just went to some the usual players, the usual suspects, and gave them the rights to set up these large plants. So I think there are a lot of missed opportunities in this. That doesn't mean that we can't do a lot more. As I was saying when you were gone, Dhanasree, we have this new states are preparing their second round of state action plans, and they need to really start thinking about how in this, I would say, how they're going to integrate climate change with existing development programs, and how climate is not going to be relegated to these projects that need to be done in these state action plans, but is going to become part of various government sectors or systems, and which is happening which is happening reasonably well in the area of disaster management. But because extreme events have become, have been recognized as a serious threat, but at the same time, so in forests in Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh and some other sectors, this is happening. But what needs to happen, say, in parts of the country, so we need to really start thinking about how we can and water is already a big challenge in many parts of the country. So we need to really start thinking about how we can rebuild, enhance water storage, better use of water, better regulation, and better management at different scales.
And especially at the local scale, the community scale, we really have a lot of missed opportunities, and perhaps this emphasis on the small and medium enterprise. I come back to that, the micro and small enterprises in particular. One can start thinking about having repair cultures. The very, very large numbers of youth who could be engaged in repairing, reusing equipment. Setting up solar panels in households, but or community level solar enterprises, but also having crores of youth find ways to sort of repair and maintain these systems and so on. Right? So there are all kinds of opportunities, all kinds of models that one can conceptualize in a Make in India sort of mode.
Yeah. Okay. So the poll, in fact, it's interesting results. Most people feel there is a lack of political will. Just followed by geo-economic and geopolitical constraints. Nationalism, populism doesn't seem to be a major factor at this point. And anti-science sentiments, of course, that is something, again, I don't see our audience really connecting with it as much as the lack of political will. So maybe, you can tell us like what really can bring about some kind of political will to act on this, like at the national or the state level, which you mentioned is very important because we have state action plans on climate change, and which again have a lot of targets set. And so, what is your take on the status of political will as such?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, good point to start with. And I referred to something that Sujatha mentioned earlier. She talked about uh, $500 billion, $500 billion in subsidies given to fossil fuel companies. So the moment of crisis comes, and you see, what do you see national governments around the world doing? They immediately use the crisis as an opportunity to go and give money to fossil fuel companies. Why do they do that? Because they're captive to those companies, right? So we have to understand we have to sort of parse or unpack this term political will. Political will isn't somebody sitting there having the right attitude. It's really who's influencing them. What are they actually beholden to, right? So what set of elite networks is actually ruling the world? That's the question we need to ask. Start by asking in order to understand what do we mean by political will.
So who is influencing the politics and the decision making?
Right. So follow the money, figure out where the money is being spent, increase the transparency of reporting on money, right? Both for political campaigns, but also for government support to various initiatives. And I'm not just talking about this country. This is happening throughout the world, right? Every part of the world, this is what is happening. That's what this OECD report is saying. And so we really need to pay very close attention to these kinds of institutions. These are the what is called white collar crime, right? And white collar crime is something that we simply don't have the mechanism to understand. We don't call it corruption, but that's the real political scientists would call grand corruption, political corruption, right? So we really need to understand how these systems are operating and what the sort of the pressures are. And democratization means actually paying attention to that and responding to that, right? And so we have to then ask the question, who's reporting this, right? And there's a very small group of people who are actually reporting on white collar crime. There's this ICIJ, I think, International Committee on Investigative Journalists. Nobody's heard of them, but they expose all kinds of global scandals involving
Panama Papers,
the Panama Papers from a few years ago, the Paradise Papers, all of those came out through ICIJ. So I think we really need to pay attention to the influences on political parties and figures and institutions in order to try and understand how do we actually improve political will. Because improving political will means democratizing. And we need to understand the process of democratization that will actually make this happen.
Okay.
I just want to come back, if you have the time, to you were conflating some anti-science relating to COVID with climate and putting them at the same level. I think they're at completely different. They're not on par. So the anti-science, it's a movement in climate change, which is being systematically funded by lobbies that are paid for by fossil fuel companies. So if you take Koch brothers, they have set up a whole lot of groups. They are funding a whole lot. If you go and look up what they are funding, the Koch Foundation, they are funding almost a very large number of universities. They are funding various think tanks. And so you have a systematic machinery that have been set up. It is managed, run, and by lobbies. There are think tanks that function as if they pretend to do science-like work. And every time there is a consensus among scientists about something having to do with science, on climate science, they'll come out and sow doubt on it. So, they kind of take on the trappings of science, but actually they are trying to dismantle various agreements on scientific agreements and various things. And this is fully paid for by the Koch brothers and others like them. And they have taken lessons from the tobacco industries. And in fact, the same lawyers who work for the tobacco industry are working for this kind of climate denier industry. And to understand all of this kind of dynamics, you have to go and look at Naomi Oreskes and the kind of work, Merchants of Doubt, the film that she's made, the book that's been out. And there are lots of, there are some people who closely follow what is going on. In relation to COVID, I think a lot of the problems are really about one is not understanding. One is there's a lot of ignorance in general about what kind of disease this is going to be, what kind of mutations are going to take place, how is it going to be manifested, how well is it going to spread. Even though the broad patterns are understood from other viruses, the every virus has a particular kind of signatures, and that needed to be understood. Apart from that, I would say that one thing that is really important and which is lacking, and in India and in other places, is that we need to understand in terms of numbers. When governments provide numbers, they need to tell us what numbers those are, where they came from, what method was used to obtain that information. Meaning, how do they do the sampling? When you're saying so many people tested positive, for example, who was tested? They came to you or you went to them? Are they a broad population or are they people who showed symptoms? All of this, as you know, mean completely different things. So they have to tell us what. Then, when they provide instructions on what people need to do, they should give the logic. Because people are not wearing masks, people are not washing their hands, people don't understand what the logic is behind it. So you can't simply, give instructions in different languages and expect people to follow them. It's good that they're giving them in different languages. They need to provide the logic. So these are all very important things. And at various points, I think people don't expect their governments to be infallible because they're working through certain logic and, they don't know. So institutions fail. But they expect them to be accountable. So when you explain your logic and what you're doing and how you're doing things, I think it builds public trust, which is extremely important, especially in this kind of a crisis when we are facing a pandemic or when we are going to face in future other kinds of climate and other kinds of crises. I think I just wanted to address that because I think it's important and it was on your mind, and I'm certainly interested in the subject.
Yeah, I think there are many questions. I'm just going to choose maybe a few if you are ready to wait for maybe 10-15 minutes, if that's fine with everyone. Yeah, so there are a couple of questions on the Arctic region in specific because this is a region that is really susceptible to climate change. There's a lot of politics, geoeconomics that is going on in the region with the involvement of so many different countries and corporations and everyone else. So the question is so while states and reports advocate the use of natural gas, coral reefs, increased ship movements, exploitation of sensitive regions like the Arctic will amount for long-term ecosystem and climate damage. So are we really trying to achieve comparative reduced emissions, or are we trying to be very selective in our vision and want to reduce only certain types of emissions? So, so in regions such as those, there seems to be a lot of, there's a lot of division in terms of, if you look at countries like Russia, which is far ahead in terms of trying to extract gas and oil from the region. Others are still Norway is another country which is also spearheading a lot of efforts. US is also trying to join the bandwagon. So there are a lot of countries which are involved there. At the same time, there is so much emphasis on the science part. The science diplomacy going on through the Arctic Council. All of that is going on. So how do you really balance those views? And there are actually two questions on the Arctic, so I just thought of clubbing them. What is your opinion on that?
Did you want to take it?
No, well, I mean, I don't know what balance means. I mean, if they are going to go there and if the Arctic nations, they have put out reports, and I haven't seen the science part, but they have put out reports. There's been a report on the kinds of changes taking place, and the fact that there are various countries, of course, trying to position themselves in order to have access to the oil and gas that you find in that region. And this is actually one of the huge, the conundrums of climate change. That there are many of the things that are opportunities that are made available by melting ice and snow and the impacts of climate change end up actually leading to situations where you increase emissions. So I don't think that we should be thinking about natural gas as opposed to other petroleum in these areas, but we should be really talking about reducing the total amount of emissions that we are putting out there, whether they are hidden and coming from permafrost or whether they are from actively, extracting fuel from different parts of the world and wherever they are buried.
We have enough fossil fuels to completely to raise temperatures by about 10 degrees. And a lot of it is in remote areas like the Arctic and the Antarctic. The Antarctic is still unexplored, but if we were to take all the fossil fuel resources that we have underground and burn it, easily we're going to a 10-degree rise in global.
So which means that the limit really cannot be, the fact that we've run out of fossil fuels. Yeah. We basically want to move. If we're talking about the next less than a decade, we want to move out of fossil fuels altogether. And
so there's a big campaign called "Leave It in the Ground," and this is based on very good science. I mean, if you go to, I think, Nature magazine from about 5 to 10 years ago, I can't remember that period, about 5 years ago or less, there was an article showing, exactly how much fossil, how much the Antarctica and Greenland would melt based on how much fossil fuel we extract from each of these regions. I mean, this is a kind of a scenario-based study, but nevertheless, it's very stark. And and how many meters of sea level rise we can expect. So how much, billions of people live along the coast. So if they're willing to sacrifice their lives for a few more years of fossil fuels, a few more decades of fossil fuels, then that's the kind of trade-off that they should be talking about.
Yeah. So there's another interesting question about the education sector. I thought I should pose this question to you for sure, because both of you belong to the education sector as well. And how do you think this sector should restructure itself by integrating issues of sustainability, climate change, all those issues, which are still being dealt with, I would say, in silos, in most of the curricula or courses or whatever we are talking, or we have very selective courses on those issues. So how do you really restructure or improvise the education sector to make sure that you are exposed to these issues at a very early age itself?
See, one of the things that I would say that this COVID crisis has shown us is that, we are all connected, not just to each other across the world, but we are connected. We are all part of the web of life. So the biotic and the abiotic aspects of the world are all connected. And but this kind of interconnection of different systems, especially our connections with the ecological world, is not emphasized or is not taught in the way in which all of our different courses are taught in school and college. So, in fact, my last article in the Hindu was about this. So if someone's interested in it, they should just look at it, where I've taken examples and said, so for example, if we were, when now we have people who are talking about writing modern history by looking at the kinds of ecological changes that were taking place. When the British were here in India and they set up the railways to make it more convenient to extract goods from India of different kinds, they were running those trains on wood, because we had, so if you think of train, you think of steam engines running on coal, but this was on wood. And we never learn or discuss what happened with all that deforestation that took place in that time in one fell swoop, and what were the implications for the local ecology. When we are teaching about cities, we don't geography. We don't talk about the kind of impact that is happening that it makes on, say, the water bodies or the hinterland, or the changes that take place to the coastline. So these are kinds of things that need to be part of the way in which subjects are taught. We tend to teach even biology and chemistry, a periodic table and biology, you start with the cells and all that. I think start with the kind of interconnections that are, these subjects actually offer that. Start with the cycles that are connected, the carbon cycle and other cycles, and how are we connected? How are our living systems connected with the rest of the world, and how we are a part of it? And that needs to be something that comes through in the way in which lessons are taught. And I'm sorry, there are a lot of examples in that article of mine. In case someone's more interested, they can look at it.
Also, I want to just add one more thing. Wipro Foundation in Bangalore had an initiative, and I don't know if it's still ongoing, to try and ask this very question, especially for engineering and management institutes. How can you integrate questions of sustainability into the curriculum? And there was a lot of interest from some faculty. But at the same time, there's also a lot of resistance, right? People don't want to kind of change the way in which they teach things and so on. So I think it's going to be hard. I mean, I teach in the social sciences, and I know that very few colleagues of mine are really interested in ecological issues and sustainability. They'll say, well, you work on that. We don't ask questions.
So that means it's going to involve a lot of learning and unlearning. So we'll have to learn to not teach something in a particular way, but actually start actually, I think that can be a fun thing to do, but not everyone has that takes that view. I mean, because imagine introducing ecological. So in fact, a lot of writing these days takes place like that. The Unruly Waters, that book by Sunil Amrit, talks. It describes the political and economic and development changes that are taking place just pre-independence and then also in the post-independent period. But it's really a book about water. About water, how it is used, how it flows, how it's dammed, and kind of the various problems as a result of that. But it does not ignore the political and economic changes taking place in the landscape and what is going on at the same time. So I think it's possible to write and learn by paying attention to the natural world around us, and I think that is one big takeaway for education, I think.
Okay. So there's another interesting question now, like instead of restricting ourselves to just climate action, so if you want to pick like SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, which is another major environmental milestone which is there in the international environmental governance. So India is placed at 117th position in the SDG index that was released. So what do you think, how do you think the SDGs are going to be affected because of the COVID situation that we are in?
I mean,
I know it's very broad, but yeah.
The SDGs for, the different states in India have come up in order to achieve the goals. They have come up with targets, and I know that this was in process at least for some of the states that I have followed. I don't know about all of them, what state their position they are in. But the thing is that obviously the health aspects, I think actually given the fact that the economy has taken such a big hit, almost all of the SDGs are going to be affected to various extents because they're all connected. They're not separate. We put them separately just to facilitate government programs and schemes, but they're all connected. Apart from that, I would say that the fact that the SDGs, if they are going to be hit, then at the same time, we are going to make it very difficult to address poor, bad development will make it that much harder to deal with climate change. And so I think these are I would say all of them will be affected.
Yeah,
would add to that?
you should make about SDGs is that Sustainable Development Goals and climate goals are joined at the hip. They're not separate entities. Yeah. In fact, if you want, and India has actually taken a very good position on that. When we went to the COP, I think we've lost Dhanasree again, but when we went, in Paris, when we put out our INDCs, our intended nationally determined contributions, one of the things we said was, we framed it in such a way that our climate objectives were going to be co-benefits of pursuing sustainable development objectives, right? So in a sense, that has been our guiding principle.
To put sustainable development first and to think of the benefits to climate as arising from paying attention to sustainable development. And I think that is a really good thing that we have done, because the goal should be sustainable development, while climate will take care of itself if we pay attention to climate change impacts and building resilience.
Right. So I think we just have time for one more question, a short question maybe. And Probably I will just take this question. Again, I think the problem, Dhanasree has lost her power again. I think it's come back. So it'll take her about 10 minutes to get back on. So I'll just ask the question. And so this question is more with regard to the type of information or the type of scientific literature, the contribution to scientific literature that is there. So the question which has been posed is, please comment on the lack of adequate scientific literature from developing countries in IPCC assessment reports. That's I think, a very specific question which has been pointed out. So your views on that in terms of
You know, the next round of IPCC reports are expected in the next year. So we'll have to see. They have made very special effort to try to get more papers and book chapters. They don't take reports, but papers, peer-reviewed papers and book chapters from people in developing countries. So we need to see more of that, and but I hope that is addressed in the next IPCC.
So the
right,
IPCC assessment process is basically, it's a peer review process where they collect, you know, the report itself doesn't generate new information. It compiles existing information. So
right,
part of the challenge until quite recently is that developing countries haven't been publishing peer-reviewed articles, especially on climate change mitigation, adaptation, and so on, and impacts. A lot, especially on the science and impacts, a lot of climate change, climate change science, a lot of that comes from labs that have extremely well established infrastructure and so on. Most of them are in Europe and North America and so on. So that's been part of the challenge. It's skewed towards the global north. But increasingly, you'll find more work on adaptation, perhaps mitigation, and climate change economics and
Yes,
so on
in
from the
developing
global
countries.
south. Yeah.
right. So I think that was a really engaging session, which covered actually a large bit of issues, starting from the Indian perspective, where we started looking at the COVID crisis itself, and then it very beautifully panned out to looking at global issues, which was very interesting. And I think we should give it to the audience also to have very interesting and pointed questions, and I think that added a lot of value. So I would just request Aditi now to just conclude the session and probably make a few announcements about our continuing webinar series. Yeah, Aditi, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Yes, good evening, and thank you so much for that fascinating and eye-opening discussion. We've discussed a host of issues that all sort of circle around the current COVID-19 crisis that the world is going through. For example, how existing social inequality is manifested in the COVID crisis, how the global response towards COVID is rooted in social institutions. As you mentioned, due to the interconnectedness of humanity and globalization broadly, while we're all facing the same pandemic, the impact has been extremely varied because of a disparity in institutional mechanisms. And how we've realized that the source of the role of social security has been pivotal, and it's taken a pandemic for that to come to the forefront, so to speak. And then, of course, the discussion about the ongoing climate crisis, how we're addressing it at a global level, and how we can address it at a state level as well. That was a very thorough and in depth discussion. So, thank you to everyone for your questions. You've been a great audience, and in case we didn't have time to answer your question due to the paucity of time, please reach out to us via email. We'll be very happy to forward your question to the speakers. And before we conclude for the day, please spare us a few more minutes of your time. This is our third webinar series, and we take your feedback and opinions very seriously. The feedback and opinion given to us by our audience during the previous webinars have, in fact, helped shape this particular series as well. So there will be a poll that will appear on your screen in a few seconds. It's just a couple of questions, so we request you to fill it up. May we have the poll, please? Yeah, I think the first question is up on your screen. So it's just, I think, about 5 or 6 questions. Once again, thank you for your cooperation. And once you're done answering the question, just scroll all the way down. There's a submit button. Just hit that. And while that's happening, I'd like to conclude today's webinar on a time for planetary solidarity, learning lessons, and the need for fundamental change. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Sujatha Byravan, Dr. Sudhir Chella Rajan, and Dr. Dhanasree Jayaram for their insight and their knowledge and for sharing it with us, of course. It's been an absolute pleasure to host you. On behalf of the entire team at COVINTS, I would like to thank all the participants for showing their support by joining the session today. COVINTS, PRISM, and the Center for Climate Studies at Manipal hope to see you in all our future webinars as well. As you're probably aware, today's webinar is part of the ongoing series on climate change, environmental security, and political risks. On the 9th of July, a week from today, we'll be hosting Dr. Ulka Kelkar and Dr. Cleo Pascal on the topic Geopolitics, Geoeconomics, and the post-COVID-19 green recovery. So make sure you mark your calendars for that as well. There'll be webinars every Thursday from today until the 23rd of July. Do remember that you will also receive a certificate of participation after you attend all the webinars in the series. Finally, please reach out to us if you would like to know more about our products and services. You can also get in touch via our social media platforms on Facebook, Twitter, or LinkedIn. Keep an eye out for announcements that we will be making on those platforms regarding future webinars as well as a couple of courses. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and thank you wherever you are. Stay safe and have a good night.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to say thank you so much to both of you. Yeah, I mean, I'm coming in and going out, unfortunately, but it was a great session. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it was a wonderful session, and yeah, there were many more questions, but like Vignesh said, we just had to pick and choose a few. But yeah, hope to continue this conversation. Like Aditi also mentioned, we have a few more webinars coming up, and a lot of these issues will be spoken about by the other speakers as well, threadbare. So it should be interesting, hopefully. Thank you to both of you for your support, and thank you to the audience for coming online and listening to this. We've had a huge audience. In fact, I'm quite happy to see that there are a lot of people who are interested in this, and this interest should, have a lot of momentum going on in the future as well. So yeah. All right. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.